Inside the Ashbury Grand Hotel in Charleston, the chandeliers scattered light across a ballroom, drawing nearly 400 guests to a charity gala for families burned out of their homes. In a side parlor off the main hall, Trent Holloway stood at the bar holding a glass of bourbon, having arranged a joke meant to humiliate a coworker he quietly despised. The door opened, and Marcus Whitfield, a black single father, walked in holding the small hand of his 6-year-old daughter, Naomi, who clutched a worn cloth rabbit named Pepper. The laughter from Trent's table rose like birds startled from a branch. Marcus had grown up in North Charleston, the son of an electrician and a night shift nurse who worked at the old Roper Hospital on the river. From the time he was small, he had loved the way broken things became whole again under careful hands. He had not gone to a 4-year college because his family could not afford the tuition that would have been required of a young man with no scholarship and no connections, and he had never been the kind of person to resent that. He had learned a trade at the technical college on Rivers Avenue, taken pride in it, and married at 23 a woman named Yvette, who had at first loved his steadiness and later, over too many quiet years, learned to lean on it the way a tired house leans on its frame. Yvette had died of complications from a congenital heart condition when Naomi was only 18 months old. Marcus had stood for a long time in the hallway of the cardiac wing that night, holding the small warm weight of his daughter in one arm and a paper cup of cold coffee in the other hand, and somewhere in the silence between those two things, he had decided what kind of father he would become. He would not be loud, he would not be perfect, but he would not be absent, and he would not let his daughter learn from him that the world owed her bitterness. In the years that followed, he had taught himself to braid hair from old videos on his phone, kneeling on the bathroom floor before sunrise, while Naomi sat patiently on a stool. He had learned to make a chicken soup that Naomi called the warm one, with rice and carrots and a little lemon, and he had mended the cuffs of a small coat outgrown across 3 winters. At work, the foreman trusted him because his repairs lasted, his invoices were honest, and he had never once raised his voice on a job site. But Trent Holloway and the men who orbited Trent had decided early on that Marcus's quiet decency was an insult to their louder, lazier lives, and they had taken to calling him Mr. Tin Box because he carried his lunch in the steel container his father had given him in 1992. The nickname was a small thing on the surface, and that was exactly what made it useful to the men who used it. They could insist it was about the lunchbox, and they could lower their voices when a supervisor walked by, and they could speak it in tones that everyone in the break room understood to mean something else. The lining under the joke was a thing every black tradesman in Charleston had felt before in 100 rooms, and no one had ever called the lining by its name out loud. Once in that break room, Naomi, who had come to the office that afternoon because the daycare closed early, had heard one of those men say that a man like her daddy needed a wife the way a stray dog needed a roof. That night in the small kitchen of their apartment off Meeting Street, she had pushed her rice around her plate for a long time before asking him, very quietly, if she was the reason he was hard to love. Marcus had set down his fork. He had looked at her for what felt like a full minute. Then, in the voice he used only when something inside him had grown still, he had told her that she was the reason he tried, every day, to be a man worth loving. He had remembered that conversation, word by word, as he buttoned the navy suit jacket he had ironed that afternoon on the kitchen counter for the night of the gala. At the center table of the parlor, Adelaide Ashbury Crane sat with her hands folded carefully in her lap, the way a woman sits when she has been taught to hold still under inspection. She was 28 years old, with chestnut hair that fell in loose waves past her shoulders, and a champagne gown that caught the chandelier light along its narrow hem. She was, by any honest measure, a beautiful woman, but the kind of beauty she carried was not the kind that asked to be looked at. It was the kind that had survived being looked at the wrong way. 6 years earlier, Adelaide had been the daughter of a low-country hotelier, whose business partner had cheated her father out of nearly everything the family owned. The Ashbury name had once meant something in a small ring of inns, scattered between Beaufort and Mount Pleasant, places where her father personally knew the woman who pressed the linens and the boy who polished the brass. Her father had died of a stroke 3 months after the loss became final. Her mother had grown ill the same winter, a slow autoimmune thing that took her piece by piece, and Adelaide, then 22 years old, had taken a job in the laundry room of a hotel that had once bought its linens from her family. She had folded sheets for 50 hours a week, and she had carried home in her hair the smell of bleach, and she had told no one in those long months that her last name had once meant something in the very rooms she now cleaned. On a wet night in October, driving home from a double shift along a narrow 2-lane road outside Somerville, she had been struck by a delivery truck that ran a red light. The months that followed had taken from her the easy gait she had grown up with, and she had walked, ever since, with the faintest catch in her right leg, the kind a person noticed only if they were looking for something to use against her. When she had finally returned to public life, the people who had once eaten dinner at her father's table had a name for her, whispered behind cupped hands at fundraisers and at supper clubs. They called her the limping charity case, because they had decided she existed at parties so that other people could feel kind for tolerating her presence. At one such party, in this very hotel 6 years earlier, a man in a gray suit had told her loudly enough for the dance floor to hear that he did not perform charity on the dance floor. She had carried that sentence with her ever since, and although she had built, in those 6 years, a hospitality empire that now owned 43 properties across 9 states, the sentence had never quite left her chest. She was at the gala that night because her company, Ashbury Hospitality Group, had finalized the purchase of the Ashbury Grand Hotel that very morning. The acquisition had carried a private meaning her board did not entirely understand. She had told her assistant she did not wish to be announced. She had asked the general manager, an older gentleman named George Whitman, to allow her to observe the property's culture from inside it for one evening, the way a doctor listens to a heart before deciding on the medicine. So she had taken a seat in the side parlor without ceremony, ordered a glass of water with lemon, and watched the room the way a woman watches a familiar storm move across a coast she has lived on her whole life. Trent Holloway had been waiting for his cue all evening. The moment Marcus and Naomi stepped further into the parlor, Trent rose from his seat, raised his glass, and called across the carpet in a voice meant to carry to every corner of the room. He told the parlor he was so glad Marcus had finally arrived, because he and the boys had found the perfect match for him, and a woman so perfectly suited to a tired black single father that the two of them might as well have been ordered from the same catalog. A few of the men at his table laughed before they had fully understood the joke, the way men laugh when they have decided in advance that, whatever the punchline is, they will be on the right side of it. One of those men, a heavy-set fellow named Dwight, with a thin reddish mustache, leaned forward and added, in a voice he meant to be charming, that at least the woman at the center table would not mind that Marcus mopped floors for a living, because she was probably grateful anyone wanted to sit with her at all. Half-laughter spread along the bar. A few older guests at neighboring tables stopped chewing. A woman in a dove-gray dress at the table by the window set her fork down and looked, for the first time, at the small girl standing beside Marcus's leg. Marcus walked the length of the parlor in silence, with Naomi pressed close to his hip. He stopped a respectful distance from the center table, nodded once at the seated woman, and said good evening with the calm courtesy he would have offered any stranger in any room in his life. Adelaide returned the nod without lifting her eyes, and Trent, sensing the room was not yet hot enough for what he had planned, stepped forward to fan the flame. He announced, more loudly this time, that this pairing was a gift to the city, a single father with no time for his own life, and a woman the city itself had decided to forget. He invited the room to raise their glasses to the couple of the year, and he added, with the kind of wink men use when they want to invite cruelty without owning it, that no one else had wanted either of them, so it was only fair they had each other. The remark that did the real damage came a second later, from the man with the thin mustache. He glanced down at Naomi, who was clutching Pepper against her chest with both small hands, and he said, loud enough for the parlor to hear, that the woman across the table could practice being a stepmother right away and save herself some time. The sentence landed in the parlor like a glass dropped on tile. A waiter near the wall closed his eyes for a moment, as though the sound had struck him personally. Naomi tightened her grip on Pepper and pressed her shoulder into the side of her father's thigh. She did not cry, because she had already learned, the way some children learn too early, that crying in public around certain kinds of men only made them laugh harder. Marcus felt the small weight of her against his leg, and something inside his chest moved from caution into resolve. Marcus did not raise his voice. He did not turn toward Trent's table. He bent down instead, and whispered to Naomi to stand close to him for just a moment longer. And then he stepped to the empty chair at Adelaide's table, drew it back, and offered it to her with the same simple gesture a grandson offers his grandmother on a Sunday afternoon in a church basement. He pulled out a second chair for Naomi, settled the small girl into it, and placed Pepper carefully on her lap so that the rabbit's worn ears rested against the edge of the table. Only then did he take his own seat across from Adelaide and lift his eyes to meet hers. He told her, in a voice meant only for her, that he was sorry. He told her that whatever this evening had been arranged to be, she did not deserve to be made into a punchline by men who had not earned the right to speak her name. The words were not loud enough to silence the room, but they were said clearly enough that those at the nearest tables heard them, and one by one, the small conversations near them slowed and went still. Adelaide lifted her gaze from her water glass for the first time since Marcus had entered the parlor, and what she saw on his face surprised her more than the apology itself. She saw a man who had not yet noticed that he had done anything noble. She saw a man who believed in some quiet and absolute way that what he had just done was the only thing a person could have done in that situation, and that there was no credit owed to him for doing it. Trent, sensing the air shifting in a direction he had not planned for, gave a short laugh and called out that Marcus should not be so dramatic, that the whole thing was just a friendly evening among colleagues, and Marcus was making a scene out of nothing. Marcus turned his head then, slowly, with the patient dignity of a man who had spent his entire working life choosing not to react when reaction was what other men wanted from him. He looked at Trent across the parlor, and he told him evenly that if this was Trent's idea of helping a coworker find a partner, he understood now exactly why Trent did not know how to respect any woman at all, in any room, on any night of the week. A few people at neighboring tables drew breath at the same time. The waiter at the wall set down the bottle of wine he had been about to pour, and folded his hands behind his back instead, the way servers do when they have decided to witness something rather than serve through it. Marcus was not finished. He told the parlor, without raising his voice, that he had come here tonight because a coworker had told him there was a kind woman who wished to be introduced to him, and that he had not come to sit in a room where grown men insulted strangers and called it humor. He glanced briefly at Naomi, who was watching him now with a small, serious expression, and he told the room that he would not allow his daughter to learn, from him or from anyone else, that laughing at someone else's pain was the same thing as having a sense of humor. He added, more quietly, that there were jokes that were jokes, and there were jokes that were tests of how much a person could take before someone in the room finally said no, and he had decided a long time ago that he would always be the one in the room who said no. The parlor went quiet in a way that even the pianist a wall away seemed to feel, because the music slowed and then dropped to a softer phrase, the way music does when a player senses the room has stopped being a room and started being something else. Adelaide watched Marcus's profile in that quiet. She felt something inside her, something that had been frozen for a very long time, shift just slightly, the way the first crack runs across the surface of a lake that has not moved in years. Marcus turned back to Adelaide once the silence had settled, and his tone changed entirely. It became softer, almost private, although every guest within 20 feet had stopped pretending not to listen. He told her that if she wanted to leave the parlor, he would walk her out himself, all the way to her car if that was what she preferred, and he would not say another word along the way unless she asked him to. He told her that if she wanted to stay, he would sit across from her for as long as the evening lasted, and he would not let another comment land at her table without an answer. He told her, finally, that whatever she chose, she would not have to face the rest of this night alone. Adelaide had not been given a real choice in a very long time. Her family's bankruptcy had been chosen for her by men in suits with thin pens. Her injury had been chosen for her by a driver who never wrote her a letter. Her reputation in the city had been chosen for her by people who had decided long before she walked into any given room what kind of woman she was permitted to be. So she sat for a moment in the quiet that Marcus had built for her, and she felt the shape of an offer she had almost forgotten how to recognize. When she finally answered him, her voice was steady in a way that surprised even her. She told him she would like to stay. Marcus nodded once and told her simply that they would stay. For him, the matter seemed closed. Naomi, who had been watching all of this with the seriousness only 6-year-olds can manage, reached into the small velvet pocket of her dress and drew out a single mint candy wrapped in waxed paper. She slid it across the white tablecloth toward Adelaide, with the careful gravity of a child handing over something rare. She told Adelaide that her father gave her one of these whenever she felt sad, and that Adelaide could have hers tonight if she needed it more. The mint sat between them on the tablecloth like a small white stone. Adelaide looked down at the candy, and then at the child who had offered it, and then at the father whose hand rested on the back of his daughter's chair. She asked Naomi very gently whether the little girl would have any left if she gave this one away. Naomi thought about the question with the seriousness of a much older person. She told Adelaide, after a moment, that she would still have her father, and that was enough, so the candy could be Adelaide's. The sentence was not designed to wound. That was what made it dangerous. Adelaide pressed her fingertips to her mouth for a moment to steady herself, and then she lifted the small candy carefully and set it beside her water glass, as though it were a relic that had been entrusted to her. She thanked the child, and her voice did not entirely belong to her when she did. It was at that moment that an older woman at the neighboring table rose from her seat. Her name was Eleanor Pruitt. She was 73 years old, the widow of a federal judge, and the mother of a sitting state senator, whose face appeared in the Charleston papers more often than she liked. She had not spoken a word during any of what had come before. She set her napkin on her plate, smoothed the front of her dress, and walked the short distance to Trent's table with the careful, deliberate pace of a woman who had once raised 3 sons in a house that did not tolerate cruelty. She did not raise her voice. She stopped at the edge of his table, looked down at him, and told him that her late husband had once said something she had repeated to her sons every year on their birthdays. She said her husband used to tell their boys that the way a man behaved toward a woman and a child in front of other people was exactly the way he behaved toward them after the door was closed, and that nothing a man did in private ever surprised the people who had watched him in public. She told Trent, very evenly, that she had been watching him in public for the last 20 minutes. Then she turned, and she walked the few steps to Adelaide's table, and she asked Marcus, with the same calm formality, whether she might sit with them. Marcus rose from his chair and pulled out the seat beside Adelaide for her. It was the first public sign that the room was changing sides. The first course arrived in a hush, and the table found, almost by accident, the rhythm of 3 people and a child who had decided to be present for one another without yet knowing why. Marcus asked Adelaide whether she preferred the salmon to the chicken. Adelaide, sounding faintly surprised at the ordinariness of the question, told him she did not really mind. He asked her if she came to events like this often. She told him she had, in another version of her life, but that it had been a long time since she felt easy in a room of strangers. He did not press her. Adelaide had been studied for years by men who wanted something from her, and she had grown skilled at recognizing the angles of their questions. She did not recognize any angles in Marcus's. He was asking what he asked because he wanted her to be comfortable, and that was so unfamiliar to her that she found herself answering him more honestly than she had intended to answer anyone in a long time. Trent had been watching the table from across the parlor, and what he saw there had begun to ruin his evening. The laughter at his own table had thinned. 2 of his colleagues were studying their plates with sudden interest. The woman beside his table had turned her chair slightly so that her shoulder was angled away from him, and the older couple 2 tables over had stopped speaking entirely, which was somehow worse than if they had been speaking against him. The joke he had built so carefully was no longer funny, and Trent, who had spent his entire adult life mistaking attention for respect, could not bear the loss of the room. He stood up with his bourbon glass and crossed the carpet, stopping at the edge of Adelaide's table. He looked down at the 3 adults and the small girl with an expression he believed was charming, and remarked that the picture they made was almost beautiful. A poor black single father playing the gentleman, a woman the city had once pitied playing the lady, and an old widow chaperoning the whole arrangement. The parlor cooled by several degrees. Adelaide's hands stilled on the stem of her water glass. Naomi stopped coloring. Eleanor Pruitt set down her butter knife slowly and rested her hands on either side of her bread plate. Marcus set his fork down on the rim of his plate without a sound. Trent leaned in and addressed Marcus directly. He asked him to be honest, just this once, in front of the people who knew him. He asked him whether, if Marcus had any other choice in the world tonight, he would still be sitting at this table with this woman. The question was the kind a small man asks when he wants a larger man to lie in public. Marcus glanced at Adelaide first, with a softness that was not for Trent at all. the way a man checks on someone he has decided to keep safe. Then he stood up. He did not lean forward, he did not push his chair back hard. He rose to his full height, and he answered Trent in a voice that did not need volume to reach every corner of the parlor. He said yes. He said he would still sit. He said he would sit at any table where someone was being insulted, because he could not, in good conscience, sit at a table where someone was insulting them. Trent tried, with a thin smile, to say that Marcus was acting morally superior. Marcus shook his head once. He told Trent, very quietly, that he was not trying to be better than anyone in the room. He was only trying not to become the kind of man his daughter would one day be ashamed to call her father. It was then that Naomi set her crayon down. She climbed off her chair, walked the few small steps around the side of the table, and stopped in the open carpet between her father and Trent. She held Pepper against her chest with both arms, the way children hold things they are afraid will be taken from them. Her voice, when she spoke, was small, but it carried in the new quiet of the parlor like a single note struck on glass. She looked up at Trent. She called him sir because that was the word her father used when he spoke to men he did not respect but still chose to be polite to. She told him, without elaboration, that her father said grown-ups who were really kind did not make other people cry and then call it a joke. She said it the way a child reports a rule learned at school, with the simple certainty of someone who had been told something true and had not yet learned to doubt it. Then she turned more carefully toward Adelaide. She told her, very quietly, that she could see Adelaide was trying not to cry, and that it was all right, because she had already seen. She told Adelaide that if no one else wanted to sit with her, her father would sit, and so would she. She held out one small hand, palm up. Adelaide took it. She did not trust her own voice, so she did not try to use it. Across the parlor, a woman at the far table lifted her napkin to her mouth and did not lower it for some time. The side parlor's doors opened then, not with drama, but with the quiet authority of a hinge that had been waiting all night to swing. The general manager of the Ashbury Grand Hotel, a silver-haired gentleman named George Whitman, stepped through the doorway with two assistants behind him. He had been searching for Adelaide for the better part of an hour, and his face, when he saw her at the center table with her napkin pressed to her cheek and a small dark-haired child holding her hand, slackened with concern and then sharpened with apology. He crossed to the table and inclined his head with a formality that did not belong to ordinary hotel work. He told her, calling her Miss Ashbury, that he was sorry for the delay, that the board was waiting for her in the main hall, and that he had not realized she had taken her seat in this parlor, instead of in the executive lounge upstairs. He asked her, gently, whether she required anything before he escorted her back. A soft murmur ran through the parlor, the sound of people repeating one word to themselves and finding it unfamiliar in the new context. Trent's mouth opened and did not, for a moment, manage to produce a sentence. He looked at George Whitman, then at Adelaide, then back again, and his face shifted through 3 different colors before settling on something close to gray. George saw Trent then for the first time, and his eyebrows rose very slightly at the way Trent was still standing over Adelaide's chair. He spoke, this time, for the benefit of the entire room, and he chose his words with the clean precision of a man who had spent 40 years in luxury hospitality. He told the parlor that Adelaide Ashbury Crane was the chief executive officer of Ashbury Hospitality Group. He told them that her company had finalized the acquisition of the Ashbury Grand Hotel that very morning. He told them, with the smallest possible smile, that they were all of them her guests tonight. The parlor did not gasp. It did something quieter and more complete. It contracted. The older woman at the table by the door, who had earlier whispered something to her husband about Adelaide's family, lowered her gaze into her wineglass and kept it there. The heavy-set man with the thin mustache discovered something fascinating about the napkin in his lap. Trent took a half-step backward, as though physical distance might rewrite the last hour of his life. One of his 2 remaining colleagues at the bar quietly gathered his coat from the back of his chair. He did not look at Marcus as he walked toward the door. He was not leaving in solidarity with anyone. He was leaving because he had understood, in a single hard moment, that the maintenance contract between Holloway & Sons and the Ashbury Hospitality Group had just died in this room, and he did not want his face to be remembered as part of the table where it had died. Adelaide rose from her chair. She lifted her napkin, set it neatly on the table, and adjusted the sleeve of her gown with the calm of a woman who had survived rooms far worse than this one, in a city far harder than this one. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. She turned to Trent and looked him fully in the face, and her eyes, when she spoke, were not angry. They were tired in a way that anger could not have produced. She told him that she was aware he had not known who she was. She told him that this was precisely why what he had done tonight mattered. She told him, very evenly, that he had given himself permission to be cruel because he had decided, in advance, that she was no one, and, she added, after the smallest pause, that he had given himself permission to be cruel about the father of this child for the same reason, decided in advance and lined up like a row of pins. The sentence settled across the parlor, like the first snow of a season no one had been expecting. Trent used the last of his composure to call the entire incident a misunderstanding. He used the word joke 3 times in 2 sentences, the way drowning men use rope. He said it had only been a joke between co-workers. He said no one in his right mind would have meant any of it the way it had sounded. He said the whole thing had clearly gotten out of hand because everyone had been drinking, even though Adelaide had ordered nothing but water, and Marcus had not finished his first glass of wine. Adelaide listened without interrupting. When Trent had finished, she answered him with a single line that would, in the months to come, be quoted in industry trade journals across the country. She told him that a joke was only a joke when the person it was aimed at could also laugh. She turned then to George Whitman. She asked him for the guest list of the side parlor, the name of the maintenance contracting firm currently under retainer with the property, and a full report on the standards by which staff, contractors, and guests were permitted to behave at any event held under the Ashbury Hospitality name. George nodded once, took a small leather notebook and a pen from his jacket, and began to write. What Adelaide did next was the thing that would define the story afterward. She did not raise her voice. She did not order anyone humiliated in return. She did not have Trent dragged out by his collar, which would have been satisfying to almost everyone present and beneath her in every way that mattered. Instead, she turned to address the parlor as a whole, and she told them, very simply, that elegance did not live in the chandeliers above their heads, or in the cost of the wine on their tables, or in the names embroidered on the linens. She told them it lived in how each of them, on any given night, chose to treat the people who could do nothing for them in return. She told them that what she had just watched happen in this parlor would have happened, she suspected, in many other parlors in many other cities, and that the only reason it mattered tonight was because tonight, by accident, someone with the power to answer for it had been sitting at the wrong table. The contract with Halloway & Sons was terminated the following morning on documented grounds of conduct unbecoming of a vendor at any Ashbury hospitality property. Trent himself was escorted from the parlor that night by 2 members of the event security team without incident and without ceremony. He left in the end, with the only thing that had ever truly mattered to him taken away, which was the audience that had, until that night, agreed to laugh on cue. When the parlor had begun to clear, and the pianist had resumed his soft, careful playing, Adelaide returned to the center table where Marcus still stood with his daughter. Naomi, who had grown tired by then, looked up at her with the small, anxious face of a child checking on a friend, and she asked Adelaide if she was still sad. Adelaide did something then that the few remaining guests in that parlor would speak about, in their own homes, for years. She knelt in her champagne gown and her thin heels, until she was at the same height as the child, and she told Naomi that she was still a little sad, but that thanks to her, she did not feel alone. Naomi pressed the small mint candy back into her hand and told her, with the gravity of a much older person, that she could keep it. Adelaide closed her fingers around it as though it were the most expensive object in the building. In the weeks that followed, Adelaide began to design something her board did not, at first, fully understand. She called it the Second Key Program, a quiet initiative funded directly by Ashbury Hospitality. The program would acquire small, neglected houses near the company's hotels, rebuild them with care, and offer them as transitional homes to single parents and to hotel staff who had fallen into a crisis from which a paycheck alone could not pull them out. There would be no signage on the day a family moved in. There would be no press release. There would only be a key handed to a person who had not had a place to call her own in some time. Adelaide invited Marcus to her office one afternoon in late February and offered him a position as the lead technical supervisor of the program. Marcus, holding his cap in his lap and sitting very straight in the chair across from her, told her quietly that he did not believe he was qualified for a position like that and that there were men with engineering degrees who would do the job better. Adelaide leaned forward across her desk and told him she did not need a man who knew how to speak in a boardroom. She needed a man who could tell which roof was going to leak before the rain started, and one she trusted to be the person who handed the keys to the families. He took the position 2 days later. A few months after the gala, on a cool afternoon in early spring, Marcus was tightening the last fixture in the kitchen of a small 2-bedroom house on Magnolia Lane, at the edge of a quiet town an hour north of the city. The house was about to be given to a young mother named Diane Foster, who had 2 small children and a night job at a hospital. Naomi sat on the front steps drawing a sun on a piece of cardboard, her tongue caught between her teeth in concentration. Adelaide arrived a little after 4 in the afternoon, in a soft cream dress with her hair loose, carrying a thermos of coffee and a paper bag of sandwiches from a small place she had grown fond of. She was smiling more easily now than she had been able to smile on the night of the gala, and the smile reached her eyes in a way it had not reached them in years. When Diane Foster received the key, she pressed it against her mouth for a long moment before she could speak. Marcus stood off to one side of the porch and did not step forward, because he had decided long before that day that good work did not need to be observed in order to be real. Naomi came running over and tugged at Adelaide's hand and asked her, with great seriousness, whether she still had the candy. Adelaide opened her small leather purse and lifted out the mint, slightly creased now from months of being carried, and she told Naomi that she had kept it as a way of remembering the night a small girl had taught a room full of grown-ups how to behave like adults. Marcus, watching from the porch, looked at his daughter and at the woman holding the candy, and he had to glance up at the sky for a long second before he could trust his face again. The story did not end with a wedding that day. It ended instead with 3 people standing on a porch as the sun went lower behind a stand of pines, and a young mother carrying her children inside a house that finally had her name on the lease, and a quiet understanding among the adults on that porch that something had been built between them out of a single act of unexpected decency. Neither of them had been looking for it, and perhaps that was exactly why it had come.